In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 5, we've got a situation where someone at church publicly says that they're a Christian, but they're also sleeping with their stepmother. It's public knowledge, and what's more, they're proud of it. Their public life is going against their confession of faith in Jesus, and it's happening in a really ugly way. So about this person, the Apostle Paul will write, "Hand this man over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit might be saved on the day of the Lord." But what does this all mean? How are we to understand this handover to Satan? What does it mean by the destruction of the flesh? Handing over to Satan could mean a death sentence. Now, people who say this will often point to passages like the story of Ananias and Sapphira in the book of Acts chapter 5, and in places like 1 Corinthians chapter 11, where there's a death in the church because of how the church has abused the Lord's Supper. But Paul, for his part, never describes death anywhere as the destruction of the flesh. And when Paul deals with sinners and with sinful behavior in churches, in places like 2 Corinthians chapter 2, Galatians chapter 6, and 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, he doesn't call for a death sentence. And even if we do say that it's a death sentence, then we're really struggling to explain then how the spirit then might be saved. That's why it's more plausible to think that the Apostle Paul meant for some kind of physical suffering to happen, with the aim of seeing that person spiritually transformed and restored to the church community. But this is still quite a broad statement. It could mean any number of things. So is there a way to help narrow this statement down further? Now, to help answer this question, I'm very grateful for an article that was written by Robert Moses. It's titled "Physical and or Spiritual Exclusion, Ecclesial Discipline in 1 Corinthians 5. The full citation will be in the description below. Robert Moses argues that when you look closely at the language of 1 Corinthians 5 verse 5, it's quite plausible that the Apostle Paul had the book of Job in mind, because in 1 Corinthians there's actually at least 4 other allusions to the book of Job. And 1 Corinthians 5 verse 5 does sound a fair bit like Job chapter 2 verses 4 to 6. So perhaps we can look at Job chapter 2 as a possible background to 1 Corinthians 5 verse 5. And when we do compare these passages side by side, we do see some similarities. In both passages, a man is being handed over to Satan. In Job, God is the one doing the handing over. In 1 Corinthians, Paul and the church are to do the handing over. And in both passages, the handing over has a spiritual part and a physical part. In Job, God permits Satan to afflict Job's bone and flesh, but Job's life is off limits. And in 1 Corinthians, the destruction of the flesh might be compared with Job's physical suffering, and the saving of the spirit might be compared with the life of Job being spared. We're not saying that these passages are similar because of their human characters. They're clearly quite different. Job, for his part, is a righteous man, no doubt about that. But our immoral transgressor in 1 Corinthians clearly is not righteous. But what we are suggesting is that the act of someone being handed over to Satan is similar in both passages. And if that is indeed the case, then it does help us understand what was meant in 1 Corinthians 5:5 about being handed over. Because in Job, it is said that God put a protective hedge around Job. For Satan to get to Job, God had to remove that hedge, though God still places limits on Satan's power. God gives Satan permission to afflict Job's flesh and bones, but Satan can go no further. And in 1 Corinthians 5, the sexually immoral man is enjoying a protective hedge that's being part of the church community. By participating in church life, there is evidently some protection given from evil powers, which is suggested by Paul's earlier reference to the Passover. In the same way that those who celebrated the first Passover received protection from the destroyer, those who celebrate the fulfillment of that Passover in what we now call Holy Communion also receive protection from evil powers. So when Paul orders the man to be handed over to Satan, He also gives an equivalent order to put this man out of the fellowship in chapter 5, verse 13. Satan can have access to this man, but only if the church cuts this person out of participating in church life, particularly in the celebration of Holy Communion. The protective hedge of church community that this man is currently enjoying needs to be removed. And the reason why this is the case is because Satan will seek to gain access into the community if the man is not expelled. This is illustrated by the image of leaven working its way through dough in the previous verse. Yes, the church might be providing a hedge around this person, but if the presence of this man and of his sin is left unchecked, then just like the image of leaven working its way through dough, Satan and his influence will work its way through the church. So the community has a responsibility to purge sin from its midst, but to do it graciously, with the hope of spiritual transformation in the form of turning away from sin and being reconciled with the community. The allusions to Job chapter 2 establish Paul's call for some kind of physical suffering in hopes that the man will repent and return to the church. Job's suffering, for his part, would eventually lead him to an encounter with God, and he would come out of his experience a transformed man. And Paul's hope is that when the church might hand this immoral person over to physical affliction, that it will result in a change in him and an eventual return to the community. Now, this doesn't answer every question that this verse raises, but it is a helpful next step in moving the conversation forward about understanding what church life looks like. I'm Pastor Jose. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.